Hello and welcome to the Hearsay Podcast. I am your host, Dylan Gibbs, and today we are talking about judicial clerkship applications. I had a great conversation with Chiara Concini, who will be clerking at the Supreme Court of Canada for Chief Justice Richard Wagner next year in 2025. Now, it's super uncommon these days to line up a clerkship at the Supreme Court in just your second year of law school, but that's exactly what Chiara has done. And I sat down with her to find out how she made that happen. We covered the entire application process from selecting your references all the way up to preparing for an interview. And we really focused on the tips and the strategies that can make your application successful. We focused on Supreme Court of Canada applications. Chiara just went through that process, and I've been through it as well as a former clerk. But the tactics we talked about, those are more general. Those will help you if you're applying to clerk at just about any Canadian court. So stick around if you're applying to clerk, thinking about applying, or even if you just want to learn more about the process. Before we jump in, if you're not already subscribed to the Hearsay newsletter, check it out and subscribe at hearsaydaily.ca. That is a free newsletter written by me with a light, informative, and entertaining take on everything that's going on in the Canadian legal world. So check it out. You can read the archives and subscribe for free at hearsaydaily.ca. There will be a link down below in the description and the show notes. Wherever you're watching this or listening to it, there will be a link there for you to check it out. All right, here's my chat with Chiara. Chiara, great to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
What did it feel like to get a call from the Chief Justice of Canada saying you're going to be clerking for him?
I mean, I was in like a state of shock, I think, for most of the day when that happened, and it was a call pretty early in the morning, so I don't think I was even quite like fully awake and functioning yet. But an incredible feeling once it finally started to sink in.
No doubt. Background for people listening: you're in your second year at U of A. Obviously, a pretty rare thing to get a Supreme Court of Canada clerkship in your second year of law school, and even more rare for it to be with the Chief Justice. Tell me about your background a bit. What made you take the plunge and want to clerk and make those applications, especially in your second year of law school?
I took a class with Professor McKinnis. So he's a professor at the U of A, an absolutely phenomenal professor. And it's sort of in the way he teaches, where he puts a lot of emphasis both on what the law is, because obviously that's an important part of any law school class, but also on where he thinks the law should be. So theoretically, and for policy reasons, like where he thinks the law is moving or where it should be moving. And having a professor sort of put that spin on the class and incorporate those aspects of, not just where we are, but where we should be. For me, that's really what got me interested in clerking, because, especially at the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is unique, obviously, in its ability to reflect when it has a case before it on whether the law is in the right place, whether it's accomplishing what it needs to be, or whether there's changes that need to be made. And so I applied. And I will say when I applied, I had relatively low expectations for myself. I thought it would be a good experience to go through the process, hopefully get interview experience, but I mean, I would have just been happy putting together the application because it is a pretty extensive process.
I mean, a lot of people apply in second year and reapply again after, so it helps to get those practice reps in, and even if the expectations are low, you're warming yourself up for success down the road. So again, for people listening, I've been through that same process, and I want to talk with you about what that application process is like and how you go from making the decision I want to clerk to actually getting the materials ready and all the way up to interviewing with the judges there, and how you prepare for an interview like that. It's been several years since I applied. I first applied in 2017 and then again in 2018. So I think we can see what's the same, what's different, and how we approach that process. So does that sound good?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my first sort of step was starting to talk to some of my professors for reference letters.
When was that? When would that have been in your law school career?
October of the year I applied. And so I think for me, the applications were due towards the end of January. And so I'd say that was early, like relatively early, but I also knew that in general, if you're in your second year, you're probably applying for appellate clerkships, and professors get busy. And so I think it's important, to the extent possible, to start reaching out early, so you give your profs enough time to write a reference letter.
I felt the same way. I walked into second year, and the very first day of classes, I walked up to one of my professors from first year and said, I'm applying to the Supreme Court. How do we make this happen? Professor Penny, who's also at U of A, that's where I went to law school as well. I knew he had clerked at the court, and so would have some insight about what that would take and how to get the ball rolling. One of the big I think, important reasons behind that is that in first year, most of your professors, I mean, some of them you'll have worked closely with and you'll have built maybe a bit of a relationship with if you're answering questions in class or speaking. A lot of first year just comes down to your grades. And a strong reference letter isn't, Chiara or Dylan had a great first year property class with me. They got an A. That's not a strong reference letter. You want someone who can speak to your reading and writing and ability to do some legal analysis that goes beyond just participating in a class. And so from my perspective, the sooner I could talk to people and start doing research assistant work or stuff that goes beyond just participating in a class, the better that would be for me. Did you do any strategizing about who your references would be when you're thinking which profs to reach out to? And then, I mean, we can start with that. I also want to talk a bit about course selection and if you kind of strategized it all there.
Yeah. So I was really lucky that in first year, 2 of my professors had clerked at the Supreme Court. Now, obviously that had been like some time ago, but both of them I had 2 that had clerked. So one of them I worked for over the summer. And so that was a very easy ask for me because, I mean, this professor had taught me in class, and I'm relatively active in class mainly because I like to ask the questions like as they pop into my head. And so as I'm digesting, I'm sort of like saying, I don't know if I understand that. And then, so I talked a lot in class, which probably was like annoying for some people. But, I think it was, I think that's something super valuable to do in law school. But setting that aside, so that was...
I agree. I'll say if you want to clerk, especially at the Supreme Court, you need to suck it up and be the person who's being annoyingly talkative in class. Be the one asking questions, be the one engaging. It's the only way to develop that rapport with your prof. So I agree. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And I mean, not only that, like, I think just in terms of your understanding, and it maybe doesn't, I don't know if it works like this for everyone, but for me, like, I learn the best, and I do like my best learning through conversation. And so I went to office hours a lot because being able to say, like, I've got a question, I'm trying to conceptually understand this, and like talking it, having like the back and forth conversation is what really, like, I found that incredibly beneficial in first year. And so that was something I did in most of my classes, maybe not all, but I think like almost across the board, I would say that was I was in office hours like frequently. So anyway, so this one professor, I had then worked for him over the summer. And so given he had taught me in first year, I worked for him over the summer, and then I took 2 more classes with him in my first semester of 2L. And so that was a very easy ask. And then my second letter was also from one of my first year profs who had clerked at the Supreme Court. This is Professor McInnes. I then took another class with him in second year. And I think that having profs, if they've clerked, especially the Supreme Court, if they're willing to do reference letters for you, I think that helps because, like, as a former clerk, you know what's needed, you know what's required. And so if you can convey that in a reference letter and say, I clerked, and I think this person could do the job, I think that has some impact. Like, it must have some impact on the selection process because it's meaningful. It's not someone just saying in the abstract, this is a good person, great candidate. It's someone who can say, like, I did this job, and I think this person is well suited to do that job. And so if you've got profs who have clerked, or you're able to take classes with profs who have clerked, especially at the Supreme Court, I think it's something that you should explore, seeing if you can get a reference letter from them. And then my final reference letter, I think, was, I would say maybe like less strategy. It was a prof who I really respected, and this isn't a prof who clerked at the Supreme Court, but he was just one who, like, I loved his class. I did well in his class, and I just thought overall he was like a great professor. And so that one maybe was like less strategic, but at the same time, I wanted someone who, I felt comfortable asking and who I thought could, write like a strong reference letter. And so that was sort of my reference letter selection strategy. But I think, like, to the extent possible, if you've got profs in your first year who have like clerked, take classes with them in second year if you can. And even if it's the reverse, if you've got profs in second year who have clerked, if you can take more classes with them in third year, I think it's a good strategy.
Yeah, I agree. That was a lot of my thought process as well. I mean, the initial screen of, hey, after first year, did I get an A in this person's class? If not, then probably they're off the list automatically. I mean, you at least... I'm saying you want reference letters where someone can say more than you got an A in the class, but you do want someone who can comment on you doing well in their class. And, I don't say that to exclude out anyone who's, you don't have to be a straight A student necessarily. Certainly to clerk at many appellate courts in Canada, certainly to clerk at trial level courts, and even at the Supreme Court, it ultimately comes down to, a holistic application package and publications and your life experience. There's a lot more to it than just grades, but the fact of the matter is that the people who are clerking at the Supreme Court are going to have among the best grades. They're going to be in sort of the top 5% of their law school class, I think, as a general rule. And so you want to have good grades, and you want the person who's writing a reference letter to at least be able to say that they gave you a good grade.
Yeah.
So.
No, and I agree, because I think like the first like paragraph of the reference letter is your reference or your referee explaining like, how do I know this student? And so in that first section, if you can say, so and so, like Chiara took my class and she got an A, right? I taught her from first year torts. I would say, to put it in like legal terms, I would almost say it's almost like a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Like, it's something you want to have. It's something that is helpful, but that's not everything. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I agree. So my filtering process then was fairly similar. I mean, look at the classes. Who did I do well with? Fortunately for me, that included two people who had clerked at the court. Then looking beyond that, one professor actually told me that they wouldn't write me a reference letter, which I had mixed feelings about it at the time, but it's now. I mean, I'm very grateful for that. Right? The comment was basically, what could I say other than you did well in my class? So some other people took more of a problem-solving approach of how can we work together to make sure that I can say more. But I appreciated this professor's comment that they couldn't say more, and I got from that they weren't willing to find a way to say more. And so,
yeah, that's
great. Take those signals too, even if someone's not as express about that. Read into what they're saying. You don't want a lukewarm reference letter. This is one of the most important things in your package. So make sure it's strong and take any signals that they're giving you about whether it will be strong or not.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that especially if you have like offered like, let's meet, like let's chat, and you've got a prof who's sort of like maybe iffy on it, they might be really busy, and that's very understandable. But I think that as an applicant, like taking that signal and pursuing a different path is very important, because I have to imagine, like I don't know what the process looks like from the Supreme Court's end, only from the applicant's end. But if I were like reviewing applications, like lots of applications, and there was one where the reference letter was like a little meh, I think that to me I'd sort of be like, well, I've got this big of a stack of applications with phenomenal reference letters, like I'm not, if it's sort of like weak, it's not going on like the interview pile, it's going on the rejection pile. And so I think that again, it's almost like, this is sort of a weird way to picture it, but like when I do applications for anything, but I think the Supreme Court is a really important one, I just sort of view it as like the application is like a pie, and there's all these different like components of the pie that all have to like fit together and make like one pie, and each piece needs to be full, and so you need all these full pieces that come together. And so if your reference letter's like got a bite taken out of it, and that's my figurative piece of pie, then like that's going to be a problem for your application. And so you sort of want all these different components to like come together, and when taken together, they're a full pie, right? It's a full application. They're all pieces that slot together, and that's the important part of the application, is highlighting everything about you in all of the different mechanisms that the court gives you in terms of requiring writing sample, reference letter, CV, cover letter. So that's
I really like that analogy. It serves, because one appetizing piece of pie, one really good looking piece of pie, might have one of the judges saying, you know what, I like that pie. I just want that slice at the very least, right? And if you have slices in there that have a bite out of it, or shards of glass sticking out of them, that's a pretty big turnoff. No matter how good some of the other pies some of the other pieces might look, there's things that are going to get your application kind of set aside.
This is something that I think is always helpful. It's helpful to know this sort of thing earlier in your law school career so that you can really make an effort. Going to office hours in first year, speaking to your professors, asking questions. Most Supreme Court reference letters are generally longer than like a regular reference. If you're applying for a job, someone might write like a page long reference letter, but from my understanding, the letters for the Supreme Court, and this isn't maybe universally true, but I think my references for the most part wrote letters that were longer, like 2 to 3 pages. And for a professor, if they've only taught you in first year, and I mean, even if you did well in your class, it's hard to fill 2 or 3 pages with, like you said, so-and-so did great in my class. They asked a lot of questions. And so I think, like you said, the sooner you're able to, even if over your first year summer or later on, if you're able to start doing research assistant work or take more classes with those professors, that's the best thing that you can do. And I was lucky. I had taken contracts in my first year with Professor McInnes. And so taking trusts with him was the second class. And so by that point, if you're able to have some continuity between your first and second year professors, I think that probably helps in the reference letter process because they know you better. And so naturally they're able to write more and speak more to you as a person and your analysis skills rather than just they can write a good exam.
That's a very important consideration. I tried to map out some of my courses to do the same and make sure that you can build up the strength of that reference as much as you can. Is there anything else that you did or you went in to try and give those profs more to say in a reference letter? What were some of the things that you did?
Yeah, so I offered to meet with my professors. So when I reached out asking if they would serve as a reference, I said, it might be good to set up a chat sort of to talk about why I'm applying, but then I can sort of walk you through what I'm interested in law school and some of the other things I've been doing on the side. And I think that sort of helps build out the reference letter. And so I had nothing super long, but 15, 30-minute meetings with the professors who were writing reference letters for me. I think that was helpful because, first of all, it builds a stronger reference letter if, your prof is able to talk to you and sort of learn about who you are as a person, but also have an idea of what you're doing in law school and out of law school. And so for me, mooting was a really big part of my first and second year. And so that was part of our conversations that we had. I did this moot in first year and I'm doing this moot this year. And, I'm on law review and I really enjoy being on law review. So sort of things like that help give a better idea of who you are. And then the other thing that I did that I would recommend doing is if you have a piece of writing that you're comfortable sharing, if you're applying to the court, you're going to need a writing sample. I shared my writing sample with the professors who wrote me reference letters because I think on an exam, I don't know if anyone does their best writing on an exam. I know I certainly don't. Half the words are misspelled. There's dangling letters everywhere just from going so quickly, but I thought it would be helpful to send a piece of writing that I felt confident in, that I felt reflected my abilities as a writer, so that a professor could speak, not only to legal knowledge, but also to your analysis skills and the quality of your writing, which I think is probably one of the more important parts of the package that you send to the court.
Yeah, and again, speaks to the importance of being ready kind of early and on top of this and thinking about it throughout your first year and at the very least in between the summer of first and second year. Because if you're not thinking, okay, well, what is my writing sample going to be? What can I show to people as a product of my written work? You're kind of behind the 8 ball there. I went in like you. I was applying in second year. It didn't pan out for me, but that was the mindset I went in with, was how am I going to get my application in a place where come January, second semester of second year, I'll have a package put together. I had never taken a class with Professor Rod Wood, who does bankruptcy and insolvency, but I heard great things about him. I saw that his class, it was a class I wanted to take anyway, and I saw that his class had an option where you could either do 100% final or you could do a paper mixed with a final. And so I went to him again, very early on in that first week of classes, and I said, look, Professor Wood, I'm applying to the Supreme Court. I'm going to write this paper, and I'm writing it because I want you to read this paper and then write me a reference letter for the Supreme Court, which is a bit risky. It's someone who doesn't know me at all, but was confident in my ability to kind of throw myself into that subject matter and prepare something. But there's other ways to do that. It requires that strategy and planning so that how are you going to write something and how are you going to get a reference about what you're writing.
I actually think your approach is probably the best option, is to the extent that you're able to, in your first semester of 2L or the first semester of the year you're applying, take a class with a paper in an area that you think you can knock that paper out of the park and have that be part of your classwork, because I don't know, it almost lets you sort of like double up on it. I mean, you can use it for your class, you can submit it as a writing sample, and then you're not adding extra work. And I wish I could say I had thought, far enough in advance to do that, but for me, all of the papers I wrote in my first semester were factums. I didn't have anything I could use in my classwork because the court doesn't accept a portion of a factum as a writing sample. And so I ended up having to do the writing sample sort of like on the side as like an extra paper. And I will say that was not the most enjoyable experience in my first semester, was sort of having like an extra paper to write and research. To the extent you can do it as part of a class, that is the best approach, 100%. You save yourself time, and the best part about it is that you'll have a prof who hopefully is willing to read it and perhaps provide feedback.
A prof that's required to read it, which helps. It's nice. Especially the types of people who are applying for clerkships, they're throwing themselves into their classes. You don't have necessarily a ton of spare time to be working on side research projects. I know for me, I don't think I could have held myself to that if I had tried. So good for you for doing something on the side in addition to courses. But it's nice to plan. If you can get it done as part of a course, it really helps.
Yeah, I would recommend that approach.
Yeah.
Ideally, there's a different path.
I have spoken to people who are preparing the Supreme Court application process, and by the time third year comes around, they still don't have a writing sample. And it's hard to fix that kind of late in the day unless you're willing to put in a ton of extra hours. Certainly, if you're planning to apply, in third year, make sure that your second year includes some sort of paper component so that you have that to rely on.
If you're applying in your third year, which is almost ideal, if you've written something in second year that you can come back to, whether that's over the summer between second year and third year, the more time you give yourself to like sit on the piece of writing and then come back to it, the better it's going to be. I think we all have had the experience of like reading something we wrote, a year ago and being like, holy cow, like this is really, really bad. And so to the extent you're able to come back to it, I always find that I catch things that I never catch, or like I see structural problems that I didn't see the first time. And so the longer you have to sit on the piece of writing, 100%, it's just going to be better. And obviously, you may not be in a position where you have a ton of time to sit on it. And I know I definitely didn't, and it obviously turned out fine. But if you can, I think that's the best. It can't get better than that. So I know this pulls us away from like reference letters and into the sort of writing samples. But when I was applying, I had talked to someone who had clerked. And I sort of asked, what did you do for your writing samples? Like, what did you submit? Because the court allows you to submit 2. And if you're applying as a bilingual candidate, it's almost sort of set. One's going to be in English, one's going to be in French. So I think in that sense, maybe there's a little bit less strategy in terms of what you actually send in. But if you're applying in English or just in French, you're sort of like wondering, like, do I submit 2? And like, what 2 should I submit? I don't know if I have any thoughts on like the difference between doing 1 or 2, but for someone I had talked to who only applied in English, they sort of took the approach of doing 1 as sort of like a very analytical memo type paper, and then their second one was a bit more of like an essay. It was a bit more sort of like theoretical, trying to say something, really insightful about the law, and that was sort of their approach. But I'm wondering, like, Dylan, when you did your writing samples, like, what was your approach? Like, did you submit 2 each time? And what sort of, like, type of writing did you send?
I spent a lot of time thinking about strategies like that. And the first time I applied, I only had 1 paper to submit. So that was the one that went in. And it really comes back to what I said. I couldn't hold myself accountable to doing another paper in my spare time. So I had my insolvency paper that I had written for the course, and that was ready to go, and off it went. When I reapplied in third year, I had written a criminal law focused independent research paper and still had the insolvency paper, which by that point had won a writing competition. And so I had some validation that this was a strong paper and was worth submitting. From my perspective, that gave kind of a balance. I was trying to go in as an all-rounder who, hey, look at me, I'm interested in everything I can do, the corporate law stuff. I had summered at Bennett Jones. If you looked on paper, it looked like I was headed towards this big law, commercial litigation sort of practice. And I wanted to send a more generalist type of view to the court. That was the strategy that went in for me, not so much I don't know. I'm not a philosophical person. I'm very realistic and practical and quite critical, I think, when I read the law and court judgments. And so both of my papers probably had a similar flavor where it was just my approach on what I thought was the right way of doing something. But I tried to convey that well-rounded mix of public law, private law.
One of my writing samples was like that. I mean, it was crim focused, or sort of like a crim constitutional sort of blend, and it was critical. And I think having at least one piece of writing that's critical is important, and not critical in the sense that it's purely negative, but critical in the sense that you're able to provide some real analysis about what the law is and what the courts have been saying about it.
I think that's a thread that kind of weaves throughout the application process. A lot of law students, when you talk about what separates someone who's going to clerk at the Supreme Court from the rest of law students or some of their peers, is someone who reads a judgment and is not just saying, that's what the law is, the court has said it, so there it is. The people who are headed on that path and are destined to clerk or be capable of being at that court are the people who think, wait a sec, does this make sense? At the end of the day, this is a human being writing this. They're fallible, just like anyone else. And so approaching the law with that sort of critical analysis where every paragraph you're thinking, does this really make sense? Do I agree with that? And being able to take those insights and bring that into your writing sample, bring it into your interview, whatever it is, that is a really important trait to develop. And I think many people don't develop that until well after law school, which is typically past the point you would be applying for clerkships. And so the earlier you can develop that skill to be looking at court judgments and critically assessing them, the better, and the more likely you'll be able to secure an appellate clerkship, or especially a clerkship at the Supreme Court of Canada.
Yeah, for me that was like the beginning of second year, and even probably over the summer a bit, because I was working at a criminal law firm where that was a really big part of the work, was being critical and developing more like analytical skills and understanding how the law fit together. And so I think it was probably over the summer into like 2L that sort of started to happen. But if you can convey that in your writing samples or in your application, that's, I think, what everyone's looking for.
This wasn't true when I was applying. At least I don't remember seeing this in any of the court clerkship marketing materials where they're saying come apply to the court. Several of them now are saying we factor in course selection, like we're looking at your courses that you're taking. I know for me, when I planned out my third year and the courses I was planning to take, I was thinking I'm sending this transcript to the court, even if I haven't completed these courses or not, they're going to be on there. What message do I want to send about the types of things I'm interested in and taking? So, it depends how keen you are on being at the court and how much you want to strategize on those sorts of details. But that was something I kept in mind, is what courses are on my transcript and what message does that send?
Oddly enough, I think I've been more strategic about that this year in terms of taking classes that I think will help me when I'm at the court than I was in my second year. Because I think in my second year, I tried to just like knock off as many required courses as possible. And so my transcript looked like evidence, admin, civil procedure. And those are core areas. So I think it's important. But I tend to think that, when I picture like, oh, I'm sending my transcript, like you sort of think that everyone just looks down like the one little column where they've got the letter grade. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Like you said, if courts are starting to look broader, like they're looking at what classes are you taking, whether those are classes that will serve you well, that show your interest areas. And so if you're applying to like the federal court and, you haven't taken admin, like that might be something to think about taking, or taking like an immigration citizenship class. It would be like applying to the tax court and not having taken a tax class. Like, I think obviously that it's a little bit different when you're looking at the Supreme Court or some of the provincial appellate courts because the jurisdiction in terms of subject matter is broader. But that said, like courts hear a lot of crim cases. And so I think if you, haven't taken criminal procedure and you've just got your 1L crim class, like I don't think it would hurt to have that. It's funny because I'm saying this and like I'm only really starting to think about these things now, having already gone through the process, but I guess this is why we're doing a podcast. Like having this information in advance is helpful because it allows you to sort of build this into your schedule in advance and not sort of after the fact like I'm doing now. I don't know, I sort of tried to think like this year, what what is going to help me? Like, what will help me be able to like contribute in a way that's actually useful? And but I think if you can do that a year in advance and then have that on your application, I think that's obviously ideal.
Yeah, and I don't think you can go wrong, really. You have to get the essentials done, and especially if you approach it in a way as how can I be most helpful? I mean, you're going to have courses that are helpful, and it's going to come across that way. It's probably even more important in third year, in the sense that, like you say, in second year, your transcript's going to look very similar to a lot of other students, unless you've gone completely off the rails and you're saving all of your required courses for third year or something. It's going to be very similar. By the time you get to third year, when I was applying to the court, my transcript had every course that I would be taking in law school by that point. Some of them didn't have a grade associated. The last semester didn't have a grade, but my application was telling the court, here is every class I will have taken by the time I get to the court. And so certainly by that stage, you should be thinking, well, what is someone looking at this going to think in terms of how prepared this person is to have a broad understanding of at least the fundamental areas of law? And then what are their other interests, right? What signals are you sending about what your interest areas are, and how might that fit into a chamber where a judge has to pick 3 clerks? They're going to need someone who has a good understanding of criminal law. They're going to need someone who has a civil law degree. If you are one of those people, how are you conveying that in your application? And if you're not one of those people, then what are you doing to say that you are the gap filler? You're someone who can do kind of everything else. So, and that's what I tried to be in my application, was more of that gap filler. I can do anything. Anyway, it's worth thinking about for sure. I want to talk about the interview process. So what did you do to prepare for the interviews? What was your approach, and what steps did you take to get yourself ready for that?
This is my approach to like any interview ever, but I always just sort of like scroll through like 20 top interview questions, like what are your weaknesses? What's a time you made a mistake, right? Things like that, where if you haven't thought about it, it's hard to come up with something like that on the spot. But I think that was probably a smaller part of my prep, because the most prep I did was with cases, being able to find things that I agreed with and disagreed with in decisions. I think that for me, that prep work wasn't as intensive as it might be in other cases, because throughout the year I was a research assistant, and part of being a research assistant, part of my tasks was to do a weekly review of all of the appellate court decisions released in criminal and evidence law. And so I read throughout the year a lot of crim law cases, because I was reading them every week on a weekly basis. And so that was actually really helpful, because in terms of prepping for trying to understand sort of like trends in the law, or trying to pick a case that I found interesting or maybe disagreed with, a lot of that came from the work that I'd been doing during the year, which I don't think you can make up for that amount of reading in the span of 2 weeks once you find out you've got an interview. And the other part of my prep process was talking to former clerks. And so I was really fortunate when I found out I would have interviews. I had, approached one of my professors, and I said, I've got, a couple of interviews, and they put me in touch with a couple of former clerks from my law school. And those conversations were really helpful. First of all, because it's just nice to know what to expect, right? It's nice to sort of understand, okay, like the interview is going to take about this long. If it's like a 10-minute interview, that's fine. That's normal, right? So in terms of nerve calming, that was nice. But also often former clerks have the best advice on how to prepare, how many cases they think you need to prepare, what kinds of cases they think you need to prepare. And so obviously, like, I met with Dylan, and that was like an incredible conversation. I just, in terms of feeling like more comfortable and a little bit less like imposter syndrome-y, like how did this happen to me? It was grounding, right? And I think that that's one of the benefits to talking to clerks to the extent possible before your interview.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer, I think, to talk to other clerks. I'd say that about any court you want to clerk at, right? Reach out. The legal profession in general, people are happy to help students, but I think especially clerks, they're going to be, if you're talking to people who are recently clerked, they're more junior in their career, and they really are happy to share that knowledge and talk with you. And from my perspective, getting to meet people like you, Chiara, and find out that I was just so impressed by our prep call as you're preparing for your interview. And I was like, you're going to get a clerkship. I wasn't sure. Second year, I mean, it's so uncommon these days. They've moved so much towards hiring people who have an appellate clerkship under their belt that, it was tough to say. I was so impressed, but I'm still thinking, I really hope she applies next year if she doesn't get it this year, because you're a shoo-in. But reach out.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. Reach out, talk to people. They're happy to discuss, and they can help prepare you for the interview, whatever it is. I know some interviews are more substantive, some aren't. For me, the Alberta Court of Appeal, I talked to people and had gone in with the mindset that it was a little less substantive. I still prepared, thought about cases, and you want to be able to show that you are critical about the law and you think about it deeply. But the interview itself, I found, that would have been 2017 that I applied at the Alberta Court of Appeal. It was less substantive than maybe some other interviews, but I think you want to prepare as if it's going to be substantive, and then think about your hobbies and these other things in general interview questions as well. But it never hurts to prepare as if it's substantive. At the end of the day, that's going to be your job, is working with substantive law. So.
No doubt. And so I think if you sort of view the interview prep in two components, it's the substantive component and then everything else. And that for me, that everything else looked like, common interview questions that I thought could possibly be asked. Reviewing your CV, being able to talk about things that you enjoy doing, things that you do outside of law school, parts of law school that you enjoy. If you haven't really thought about that, you're gonna ramble. I'm the biggest rambler ever. You can probably tell from listening to this. Just things like that, being able to speak comfortably about how you're enjoying law school, what you're doing in law school, what parts of law school you like. And then the other thing I would say is your writing samples. Being able to talk about your writing samples, because you've written them, and often you wrote them months before you actually sent them in. So making sure you know what you said, what argument you advanced. I think that's, it sounds dumb, but it's important, because if you get asked about it, and, you get asked, why'd you write about this, right? What was the process you went through when you were writing this? How did you settle on a topic? What was your favorite part of writing this? If you don't have anything to say, it doesn't come across well. And so I, reread my writing samples. I didn't do a whole lot there, but I at least knew what I said. And I think I did that the night before. I think I did it the night before as a way to, calm my nerves and remind myself, oh, yes, I actually can write, It was sort of a calming experience, and then it also gave me a break from all the substantive work that I'd been doing to, feel comfortable speaking about a case. And, that was another piece of advice I got that I thought was really, really helpful, is when you're preparing to talk about a case, you don't need a 5-minute speech or dissertation about your thoughts on the case. No one wants to hear you go on for that long about something. The advice I got was, if you're going to say something about a case, sort of have a 1 to 2 minute summary of what did I think about this case, because for the most part, there's going to be dialogue, You're the justice or the, legal counsel interviewing you will want to ask, okay, well, what about this part of the case? And can you, expand on this? And did you agree with this? So if you get asked, tell me about a case, don't recite, every thought you've ever had about the case. You've got to pick something a bit more targeted, and it doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be about the entire case, it can be about something very specific in that case, but pick something small that you can deliver in a nice little parcel, and then you can expand on it through questions.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think you mentioned you had kind of broadly prepared, and you had all of this kind of research knowledge, and you knew cases you agree with, cases you disagree with, things like that. That's great, and that's similar to how I prepared when I was applying. I get the sense that the questions were quite regimented. I was told, you're going to be asked what is a case that you disagree with, and so I prepared with that in mind. I get the sense now that the questions are changing and there's different approach. Still a valuable way to prepare, because it shows that critical approach to the law, to think about, as you read decisions, what do you agree with, what do you disagree with? So that's great. Prepare broadly, think about what you agree with and disagree with, show that critical feel, but keep in mind, what exactly are you going to talk about? What's going to be your go-to, rank them in your mind so that you have that quick little elevator pitch. If you're asked a question and you have to talk about a case, what's the one that you're going to, and what's that short little pitch that you're going to make about it? Because I know when it came time to my interview and there was a question along the lines of, tell us about a case, I was racking my brain. I had, 5 that I had recently been thinking about, and I almost hadn't made up my mind about which one of those 5 I was going to talk about. So it would have helped me to know, this is the one I'm going to, this is exactly the point I'm starting with. And it didn't hurt me. It panned out. I got there eventually, but the more you can have that dialed in. I know exactly what case I'm going to and what I'm going to say. I think the more prepared you'll be.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. To the extent possible, I think something that helps with this is if you're able to do mock interviews with somebody, I think that that's great. And so, like, for me, it was my mom, right? I had a list of questions I thought I could feasibly be asked, and I would just sort of like hand the list over, and she would just ask me them, like, just pick randomly, right? And I think that that's incredibly helpful because it forces you in your mind to know, if I get asked this is the case I'm going to go to. This is my number one choice for the case that I feel I have the most to say about. I'm the most comfortable talking about it. This is the one I want to talk about. And if you get asked something different, what is the go-to going to be? Because I think you're right. Like, if you're sitting there floundering in the interview, sort of going like, oh, I don't know which one to talk about, like, that's not ideal, right? So have a go-to and be comfortable talking about that one. And I think, like, in terms of picking the cases you want to prepare, for me, that largely came down to picking cases that I was interested in areas of law I was interested in, because I knew that I wanted to be able to comment not just on the case, but more broadly, if it was a criminal law case or a charter case, what do I have to say about, that broader area of law in which that case falls. And so one of the cases I prepared was Beaver, the 2022 decision. For me, being able to talk about Beaver also meant being able to talk about Section 24(2) of the Charter, and just being able to situate the case more specifically within the sort of broader legal context in which it falls. And so for me, that was a go-to case for me because I knew I felt comfortable, I knew I felt solid on what I had to say, and I thought I could sort of tie it into a more recent decision the court rendered in Zacharias.
So give me your pitch. I don't want to put you on the spot, but to the extent you can, that you remember what you would have said about Beaver.
Yeah, so I think Beaver's a good example of a case because this is one where I really took to heart that piece of advice. It was like, you don't have to talk about the whole case. Like, pick something you disagree with. And so for me, what I disagreed with was it was a portion of Justice Jamal's analysis on the second prong of Grant, so the impact part of Grant. And in that part, speaking about Mr. Beaver, he sort of framed the series of charter violations as having very minimal impact because Mr. Beaver couldn't have expected to have been left alone. And I narrowed in on that and I said, I don't agree with that. And the reason why I didn't agree with it is because part of the facts in Beaver was that he had been unlawfully detained for, I think it was, in the facts, I think we're talking close to 2 hours of unlawful detention where he hadn't properly been informed of the reason for his detention, and that was, for me, impactful. And I think if you look at the Supreme Court's jurisprudence in Lee, for example, even a short unlawful detention has incredible impact on liberty interests. And so I took issue with that portion of the analysis, and I said I don't think that squares with what the court has otherwise said about unlawful detention or arbitrary detention. And then what was interesting is that I actually agreed with the outcome in Beaver. It was just that one piece of the reasoning that I disagreed with. And so, one of the things that I, would have done instead is I would have framed it differently. And I don't think you can say that the detention itself was not impactful, but I think you could say that the impact was attenuated by the fact that it, at some point in that 2-hour unlawful detention, would have become lawful, given they would have met the grounds, they would have met the reasonable suspicion standard. And so that was my elevator pitch. I picked one part of it of the decision. I said I don't agree with that. I tried to explain why. So yeah, I think that was my pitch. That was that was what I had to say about Beaver. And I think it was good because it was very focused, right? It wasn't, I disagree with the entire decision and everything that's been written. But the other thing I think that's, if you're thinking about cases to pick, Beaver was a 5-4 decision of the court, right? And so almost half of the court disagreed with what the majority had decided. And the point I disagreed on wasn't something that, had been explicitly outlined by the dissenting opinion, but it was still something that, for me, it was just more personal. I just didn't, instinctively I felt wrong about how it had been sort of framed. So I think if you can pick a decision where there's a 5-4 split, or even a 5-4 split or a 6-3 split, I think that those are the decisions that are best to sort of to jump in on and pick apart aspects, because it's a reasonable take, because almost half the court thought that it was a reasonable take. And I think that if you're coming in and you're gonna hammer a 9-0 decision, I don't know. You just want to make sure that what you're saying is legally sound.
Yeah,
And so,
at the end of the day, you're a law student, and
yeah,
there, you know, I'm sure there's some profound things you can say. I read 9-0 decisions today now, a few years called to the bar, and I've read more decisions, and I've clerked, and I've got that experience under my belt. And lots of times I read stuff in 9-0 decisions, and I think this is a little wacky, but it gives you more confidence going into an interview like that if you're relying on something where part of the court has backed you up. Beaver, I agree, it's an interesting case, and just context for anyone who's not immediately familiar with it. I mean, the police show up and arrest these two roommates, and they're detaining them really with a fake statute, right? So they take them into custody with a statute that doesn't exist. And then partway through, a seasoned detective finds out that's what happened. We need to rearrest them for murder. And so the court's really looking at, can the cops fix it just by rearresting for murder, and what steps do they have to take? So, and there's it's like you say, it's not articulated the exact way that you have, and you're bringing something unique to the table, but you can find support from comments in the dissent. It's something like, well, if this is true, if what the majority is saying is true, then every person who calls 911 and says, hey, I've found a dead body, could then be detained for virtually, for hours. And there's really no consequences of that, just based on how the majority is looking at things and how they're saying, well, there's no impact of this detention.
yeah. And I mean, what's interesting about that one is I think I gave you my elevator pitch, but one of the things I would have expanded on is there was even some parts of the dissent where I thought maybe they had framed things in a way that I didn't feel was fully reflective of the volume of information that the police would have had. And so I think the dissent's approach was basically this wasn't even close to, and this is more speaking to the arrest, but I mean the dissent found that there had been an additional charter violation from an unlawful arrest that came after the unlawful detention. And the majority disagreed. The majority found the arrest to be lawful. But one of the comments that the dissent makes is that, not only does this not meet reasonable and probable grounds, this barely meets reasonable suspicion. And I don't think they even say, it doesn't meet reasonable suspicion. And so if you're looking at the standards, reasonable suspicion for an unlawful detention and reasonable probable grounds for an arrest, and the dissent puts you even below that, I think that's something that that's something I took issue with, because I thought that they had really raised the bar on what was needed to meet these two standards. And so that was something that I disagreed with out of the dissent, where I said, I think they've got a point on this one bit, but more broadly, I think the outcome in this case was right, and I disagree with these aspects of the dissenting opinion's reasoning. And so even if you have something to say like that, if you can say, this part of the majority I think is suspect, and this part of the dissent I don't agree with either. If you can sort of read the decision holistically and not have to just pick a side, you can find nuance in the various things that are said that you agree or disagree with, and having that in an interview and being able to say, don't get too excited, I don't think the dissent quite got it right either, right? If you can sort of, have things to say on both sides, I think that's, it shows nuance. It shows that you can approach the law in a not just black and white manner, one's right, one's wrong. I don't know. I think that those are qualities that if you can highlight them, you should. And I think that's one way to do it.
I think you nailed it there. And that's exactly the process I went through in terms of finding decisions to talk about, finding split decisions, and thinking, both from the majority and the dissent, what are pieces that I agree with and disagree with? And even if you're not asked a question in the interview that is exactly, hey, tell us a case you disagree with, or tell us a case you agree with, you have now thought about things in a way where you're being critical and you're being measured. You're thinking, well, it doesn't have to be binary, like you said, one or the other. It can be pieces of both. So that's exactly how I approached it. I think the other thing to consider, your decisions were quite recent, but it's important. If you're going to talk about a decision in the interview, the judges, they deal with a lot of cases, and certainly, I mean, they're now writing 300 paragraph decisions regularly, which no one can keep in their mind and remember every word that was said, right? So you need to keep in mind that you're going to have to give some context when you're talking about things, and the judges don't have a photographic memory of everything that they wrote in the decision. And so being able to kind of give that picture of what your concern is and where it's coming from is key. Very similar to you, I picked a case where there was a dissent and a majority, and I agreed with parts of it. I talked about the Tunaha freedom of religion case. It came up in an administrative law context, so I disagreed with the way the majority handled freedom of religion. It seemed like, in cases where there's kind of more Judeo-Christian religious concepts at play, the court has always said, we just believe you. If you say you have a sincerely held religious belief, then we accept that as true. And there's a lot of things about the majority reasons in that case that kind of send a signal where we don't believe this particular belief, and we're not willing to back that one up in the same way that we do with other things. So I wasn't comfortable with that piece of the majority reasons. And then just the way, this is pre-Vavilov, so we're in an administrative law context where it wasn't exactly clear how you do a review of constitutional questions like this. And I wasn't satisfied with how either judgment handled that. They're basically doing their own analysis and then comparing it to an administrative decision maker's work and calling that reasonableness, which is not really reasonableness. It's kind of like disguised correctness review. So those were some of my concerns, but guided by exactly what you're saying, finding pieces, being measured, and adding some critical analysis beyond maybe what's evident in the face of those two decisions.
Well, and I think the great thing about Tunaha is the fact that you sort of have like the dual issues going on. Like you've got the charter aspects, and then you have the administrative law aspects with the standard of review, the Dore analysis. I mean, it's interesting. I took admin law this year, so now I feel like semi-comfortable talking about this kind of thing. But I think if you were to sort of take your analysis now in light of Vavilov and like what Vavilov says about reasonableness review, I mean, the court is pretty explicit that you're not supposed to do here's what I would do. How does it match up? Like it's not about that at all. So Tunaha decision is like a really good one. And there's usually at least like one or two big constitutional law decisions where there's like a lot of aspects to it. And so another one of the cases that I prepared was the Impact Assessment Act reference, because that obviously had constitutional law aspects to it, but it had administrative law aspects. And those were things that, I had started to feel more comfortable discussing, having taken admin, and that I wanted to highlight because a lot of the other decisions I prepared were criminal law decisions. And so like the impact assessment one was good, and if you can find decisions where there's sort of like the dual components, where there's con law aspects, but there's admin aspects, right? Or there's the charter aspects like in Tunaha, but there's also the admin aspects. Like where you have that, I think that that's great because you show diversity in your like analysis in terms of the areas of law you're comfortable with, and to the extent possible, again, like that's the kind of stuff that you want to be looking for when you're deciding what cases you want to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. Sending that message that you're someone who cares about the law, irrespective of what area it is, you just think critically about what the law should be. Ultimately, that's what the court's looking to find in their clerks. Is there any advice, just general advice or tips or anything we haven't talked about that you would say to people who are applying for clerkships?
Yeah, there's one piece of advice that it was actually the dean who gave me this piece of advice. This isn't something we've talked about. It's about the cover letter. One of the things she told me was spend time on your cover letter. Spend a lot of time on it. And I think before that conversation, I'd always been someone who sort of said, like, the cover letter is not going to get me this position. Like, it could lose me the position if it's really bad, but as long as it's like fine, like passable, it's no one really reads it. So that piece of advice changed how I approached my cover letter, because otherwise I sort of would have given like the standard, here's why I'm interested, here are my skills, and I would have just sort of sent it off and said this is good enough, right? It's not particularly interesting, but that's sort of that. And when she said spend some time on your cover letter, it just made me think a little bit more about how I wanted to approach it. So I think it's good advice. Like, take some time on your cover letter. Really think about what you want to be saying. And this will take me back to my pie analogy. But if you picture your application as that pie, think about what about you as a candidate you want to highlight that's not in anything else, and then put that in your cover letter. And so for me, the thing that I felt like was missing from my application was, like, I really wanted to convey that I love learning about the law. Like, I always want to be doing something where I'm just, like, I'm learning, I'm absorbing, I'm thinking about the law, and that's what I want my life to look like in terms of my career. And so that's one thing that I felt like was important about me as a person applying that wasn't necessarily reflected in the other parts of my application. And I really wanted to convey that. Like, I really love doing this. Like, I love reading, like, the cases. I love thinking about the law. Like, these are things that I want to be a part of my life, right? So that was something I put in my cover letter to sort of fill out the pie analogy, to like to put that missing piece like in place. And I think that that's how everyone should use a cover letter, is when you're thinking about your application, what's missing from it, put that in the cover letter, because it's sort of like a page and a half of space where you get to say like whatever you want the court to know, like put it in there. Because I think if it's a mistake to use it as like a way to recite, I have legal writing skills, right? Like, I don't think you need to talk about how great of a writer you are in your cover letter because you submitted writing samples. That's the point of the writing samples, you know? So use it to highlight things that don't, that aren't immediately apparent in the reasons why the court has asked you to submit these other things. So that's sort of like it's a good piece of advice. That will always stick with me, I think, in terms of how you should approach like a cover letter.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We didn't talk about the cover letter, and you're absolutely right. It's so critical, and it's an opportunity for you to convey some, I agree with the missing piece analogy. I think another way to use it is to tell a story and to really convey some humanity and bring out who you are, right? The working relationship between judges and their clerks at the Supreme Court especially, and any other court that hires on a kind of one-to-one judge-to-clerk basis, you're spending a lot of time with this person and you want to enjoy working with them. And so, many of the judges will approach it as if I want to hire a human being. I want someone who's easy to get along with and is, not just fully absorbed in their legal studies 24/7, like get some personality to it. And the cover letter is a great way to do that. Your writing sample isn't going to convey who you are as a person, but your cover letter can, tell that compelling personal story. I know for me, my background before law was in computer science, and I had carried some of that, approach to innovation and technology with me into law school, where I helped host this innovation conference at the U of A, and was still interested in the development of the law and how it applies to technology. And so, like you say, that's something that would not have come across. You might have seen, Bachelor of Science in Computer Science on my CV, but you're not going to get a sense of how I'm bringing that into my legal career and how I might be able to help the court grapple with novel issues of law and technology. And so finding that way to make your cover letter into a story and convey who you are as a person is super important. I agree.
I agree. Like, you want to read it and hear your voice, like hear your personal voice when you read it. Let that come through in the writing, because, you don't have to maintain a like formal, rigid legal writing style. Even if your legal writing style is like conversational, like, you don't have to maintain that like analytical tone in the entirety of your application. Again, the point is to show different aspects of yourself, and that's why the application package itself is so big. It's why you need a CV, a cover letter, all these writing samples, reference letters. Like, the point is to show different aspects of you. And so I think that, like, if you can really frame the cover letter, like you said, as a story, like let your personality come through, so when you read it, you feel yourself sort of like speaking through it. I don't know. I think that's maybe hard to translate into an actual letter, but to some extent, like, you can't give like a formula on how to do it. Like, you just have to sort of like feel it. And it's funny, like, when I wrote my cover letter, I did one draft, right? I did my first draft, and it was, I think it was boring to read. And so I ended up rewriting it, and when I rewrote it, I just sort of like wrote, I just let everything sort of like flow out, and I spent like a good couple hours just like writing it, just to try and, let it sing. And I think that was one of the stronger parts of my application. I mean, obviously I don't know. I mean, this is just a self-assessment, but I was really, I read my cover letter back, like, after getting the call from the Chief Justice, and I just sort of, I was proud of what I had written. I thought that this was it was just a good piece of writing that like really encompassed me. And I think that having that feeling about your cover letter of all things is like, it's good to have that afterwards. And so you can produce a piece of writing sort of like that. I think that's ideal.
I agree. You said there's no formula. I think the formula is, don't use the formula that you think is what a cover letter should look like, right? Because if you go through that cover letter process of, Hello, my name is Chiara, and I'm a second year student at the University of Alberta, and I want to apply at the Supreme Court, and it's just this regimented, stale, it's not going to cut it. There needs to be a story woven in there. So I completely agree. Sit down, write something free-flowing, writing that sings,
Yeah.
and it'll pay dividends. So.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fun because I at least find that I don't often have opportunities to do writing like that, where it just sort of like, you know, it just sort of all like flows out. Like it's really, it's a great place to sort of like seize that opportunity and to write a cover letter that, I don't know, yeah, it sings. Like I think that's the right way to put it.
Yeah. And you know what? You should make your entire application sing. So I think there's no better way of putting it, but think about that harmony all together and make it sing. Well, we can end on that,
Yeah.
Cara. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me. I know I found in the clerkship application process that it's very difficult to find some of this information out there. It's great. People should be going and talking to clerks, but I'm really glad that we can kind of share some of our knowledge with a broader audience. So thank you for joining me and doing that.
No, absolutely. I mean, thanks for having me. It was great to chat, and yeah, it's a really rewarding process, I think, overall. And that's the other piece of advice that I got is apply, like put yourself out there because
Yeah.
don't answer, like don't self reject, never self reject, right? So maybe the timing's not right and you want to wait another year, but like ultimately, I think if it's something you want to do, you should do it.
You heard it from Chiara. Apply, don't count yourself out, and hopefully you can use some of the strategies and tactics we talked about as you're putting that application together. That's it for this episode. Don't forget to check out the Hearsay newsletter, hearsaydaily.ca. You can read the archives and subscribe for free. That is written by me. We keep it light, entertaining, and informative. Check it out and subscribe, hearsaydaily.ca. There's also going to be more to come from the Hearsay podcast. So if this is your style of content, I'll see you on the next one.